Hey everyone, and welcome to a walkthrough of the OM-1 from OM System. We talked about many of the external features as well as some other features inside the camera in our first look video. If you haven't seen that, check it out in the link in the description. The purpose of this video is to dive into the menu system. Yes, it's a brand new menu system and we think it looks pretty good. So we're going to take a look at where the features are and maybe even see some settings that you didn't know were in the camera. This video is designed for those of you that have been using the Olympus system, or what's now called the OM system, as well as those of you that are interested in moving over from another camera maker into the OM system and want to learn more about it. Now, real quick about the name. You see Olympus on the camera, you've seen Olympus on a lot of other cameras, but it's now being rebranded as the OM system. They're keeping Olympus as a name brand that's a very recognizable brand. It's been around for a long time, but that is being transitioned over to OM system. But the way we see it, no matter what it's called, it's still going to be an amazing camera, has some unique features on it that a lot of other manufacturers don't have. So let's take a look. So with the screen flipped around, we're going to turn the camera on by using this switch with our index finger. And now we're going to press the menu button. So when you press the menu button, you're going to see a few different tabs on the top instead of on the side like we were used to on the other cameras. Now you can navigate this with a few different ways. We're going to use this thumb dial here to rotate to travel between our different tabs here. Or with the front wheel, we're actually going between tabs. So you can swap between tabs. You can go to the video mode all the way back to Photo tab 1, and then you can make those smaller changes and those submenu changes by rotating the dial, and that will take you through every page. So let's go back. You also have this directional pad. You can use up, down, left, right, but also this joystick. Let's go back to the beginning. So the first page is the basic settings and image quality. So down here, we're going to press OK. And you're going to see the large, superfine plus raw. That's my preferred setting. We're going to leave it there. You also have different pixel aspect ratios. You have it 16:9. It'll actually show you the different pixel densities while you go between 4:3, 3:4, 1:1, which is really popular for a lot of social media. You also have your image review. You can set that to 1 second. You can set it to auto. You can turn it completely off if you don't want it. And you're going to find a lot of these settings are very similar carryovers from the EM-1 system. Now let's keep going, and we're going to find some unique features. Now here we have your drive mode on page 7 of the Camera 1 tab. Anti-flicker shooting. Sequential shooting settings. You can set that to max 10 frames per second. You can change that right there. These are your drive modes. We're going to set that to 10. Why not keep it high? And you can set that for each one. We also have your Procaster settings. So if you haven't used the Procaster, this is a really cool mode. It's actually going to take photos before you even click the shutter button. So that way, if you happen to respond to something like a bird or something happening on a sports field that you didn't catch, you weren't able to respond to it as quickly, well, the camera's already starting to shoot anywhere from 10 frames, 28 frames, whatever you set it to. It's going to capture those ahead of time, so that way you know for sure that you got that action happening. We have super high 1, super high 2. Now, I do want you to bear in mind, whenever you're shooting at 120 frames per second, which is absolutely amazing, that is going to be an AF single only. So if you want to go to the continuous shooting, like shooting a bird that may be coming closer or further away, you need to recalculate that focus. You're going to cap out at 50 frames per second. And then we look into image stabilizer for stills. You have it set for auto. Auto actually works really well in our testing. We were very pleased with how that worked. You can also turn it completely off. You have 1, which is the image stabilizer, functions in all directions by detecting camera movement. IS2 is going to be vertical stabilization. Hold the camera horizontally and shoot while panning horizontally. And then the other one's going to be horizontal stabilization only, so you can be very specific on how this camera is going to be used. Depends on what orientation you have the camera set to, as well as the direction the subject matter is moving. Then we have image stabilizer. You can set it for frames per second priority. The shooting speeds get priority over image stabilization, or you can set for IS priority, which is image stabilization gets priority over shooting speed. And of course, you can turn the image stabilizer completely off if you would like. Now this is where it gets exciting. If you haven't used one of the higher end Olympus cameras, these are some settings you need to pay attention to. We have high res shot, live ND shooting, focus stacking, HDR, and multiple exposure mode. High res shot, once you enable that, and you have a choice between using it on a tripod or handheld. There are differences between the two. Now the way this works, when you press down on the shutter, the camera is going to take a series of images and then composite those into a high resolution image. This is a 20 megapixel sensor, but you're able to get up to a 50 and an 80 megapixel raw image that you can manipulate as one raw image, and it's really pretty impressive on how it works. The best results are going to be when you're using a tripod. When it's stable, you're going to get much more resolution, but sometimes you don't have anything like that, so you have to do it handheld. Sometimes you need to get that shot quickly, let it process inside the camera, and go. Now when you go into the setting, there are two different options. One which is set up for stable shooting situations, like using a tripod or setting it on something stable. That's where you're going to get an 80 megapixel raw image. And if you're shooting handheld, you're going to get a 50 megapixel raw image. And of course in settings, we can set that for however we want. We can set it for fine JPEG only. You can even go down to 25 megapixels if you need to. Then you have your fine JPEG plus RAW. So you can set this to however you want. And then we have our waiting time. You can set this to take the images right now immediately. Or if you want to set it on a tripod, make sure it's ultra stable and you want to have a slight delay before it starts taking those photos, you have those options. So we're going to go all the way down to 2 seconds. We have an option for 15 and 30 seconds. Now we have live ND shooting. This is a really cool mode. If you didn't have any NDs with you, the camera is going to do some computational calculations inside the camera to use slower and faster shutter speeds, then compositing those inside the camera. So again, it's just a really amazing time saver. So we can enable that. And as you see us go on, each tab is color-coded, not just on the top tab, but even inside the menu. So if you don't know where you are in the menu, you're not sure if you're exactly in the right tab for that setting, you can see that right now with the colors. We have ND2 all the way to ND64, so you can really darken that image, especially if it's quite bright outside. You're shooting on the beach, you're shooting in snow. This will really help you out. You can also set it for live view simulation, so you can see how that's going to look beforehand. Then we have focus stacking. A lot of you macro photographers out there are going to really enjoy this. Instead of manually doing this on your own, you can have the camera do it for you. You can set a number of shots. You can go all the way from 3 shots, all the way to 15 shots. We'll select that, go down to set focus differential, and you can set it from a level of 1 to 10, and it'll show you here on the screen. 1 is going to be narrow, and wide is going to be number 10, so you can set this for what interval you want. If you're first starting out with this, I would recommend starting at 5 and then adjusting that accordingly. Next, we have HDR shooting. You can set this for off. HDR 1 and 2 are going to be great automatic modes. No matter what you're shooting, it's going to do a good job of approximating what you need to shoot. So for example, HDR 1 is going to take 4 pictures at once at different exposures and composite them automatically into a high contrast image. HDR 2 is going to create a similar effect but have a higher contrast mode. Now if we go to these more specific modes, this first one's going to take 3 pictures with a 2-stop difference in between each one, a 5-frame difference with 2 stops in between, a 7-frame difference. Then we go down to 3 frames and 5 frames with 3 stops in between each one. If you're doing any sort of real estate photography, or any other high dynamic range situation, and you need to control the space in between each image, this is a great way to go. We'll turn that off for right now. We'll go to the multiple exposure mode. You can turn that off or on. And you can set it for overlay. So if you're doing any double exposure, this is going to be a really fun way to do that. Turn that off for now. Then if we move over, we have a digital teleconverter. And then we have interval shooting. Time lapses are so much fun. If you haven't done it, this is a great time to get into it. Go into that, make sure it's turned on. Then we have several options. Number of frames, you can go 9,999 frames. You're gonna have a lot of flexibility. You can shoot that time lapse pretty much as long as you want. And then we have our delay time. You can set this as a remote camera if you're getting a time lapse of a crowd gathering or someone putting something together and you have this high up. You can set this for hours, minutes, or seconds later. Some really late time lapses would be cool. You can set this camera up, have it wait, and then get that amazing time lapse over the course of a few hours if you wanted to. Press back, so that's your waiting time. Interval length, you have anywhere from 1 second all the way to a few hours if you wanted to. Then we'll go down to interval mode. We have the time priority, which prioritizes keeping the interval time. It skips the next shooting when the set interval cannot be kept. And then under frames priority, it starts next shooting after interval time elapses once the recent frames have been recorded. You can also set it for exposure smoothing. So if you have a pretty jarring difference between a few images, you can have that smooth over that course of time. And then of course you can enable time-lapse movie. So you can not only get those still images, you can turn on time-lapse movie and it will compile those images, essentially edit them together. You don't have to take it into Final Cut or Resolve. It's doing it inside the camera, saving you a lot of time in post. And then here are your movie settings. You can set it for HD, that's 720, Full HD, 1080, and then a 4K time lapse. And then you can also set the frame rates. You can set it for 5 frames per second, 10, 15, and 30 frames per second if you want a bit more movement in your shot. You can see an estimated time as we set those settings. And then on the side here we have start and end. That will tell you how long it's going to take. If you need to leave this camera alone, let it do its time lapse, you'll know when to come back and retrieve that camera. Autofocus modes. We have autofocus single, continuous, manual focus. We have the starry sky setting. That's a really fun one. It's going to play with that negative EV that this camera is capable of to get you some really low light shots. It'll give you that really low light capability whenever you're trying to focus on the stars. Now we'll go down to face and eye detection. So you can set this for, you can turn it completely off if you want. You can set it for face only detection, you can set it for near side eye, or you can set it for left or right priority. Now if we go down to subject detection, you see that you can completely turn it off if you don't want it to focus on unwanted subjects. Then we have cars and motorcycles, airplanes and helicopters, trains and locomotives, all different types of birds, and then we have dogs and cats. And then of course you can set it to eye detection frame. It'll have that frame around the eye, so that way you know it's capturing an eye. If that's not the right person's eye that you want it to focus on, then you'll know and you can change that. Go down here, you have your focus peaking settings. You can set it for red, black, white, yellow, whatever's going to work for your contrast. Highlight sensitivity, low, medium, high. Now if we move over to the video settings, you're going to see a few different options. We have video codec. You can set it for H.265 if your computer can handle that. If not, go to H.264. It'll work really well. You're going to have a smaller file size when you're using H.265. It's a little bit more intensive on your CPU, but it's going to save you a lot of space. Now we'll go down to the settings here. You can go to your 4K 60, your Full HD 60, your cinema mode, and you're going to see what this is going to show you is the resolution, the type of codec, the frame rate, and then you have your slow and fast turned off. And then there's your megabits per second if you want to be very careful with how much information you're putting on the card If you're shooting for hours on end, you want to be very careful with how much your data rate is depending on the size of your card. So you may have to go to a lower data rate so you can fit that entire day onto both of your cards. All you have to do is go to the side here, set your size. So that's regular 4K 3840 by 2160, or you can go to DCI, which is 4096 by 2160. And of course we have full HD. Let's go back up to Cinema 4K. And then you have your frame rate for playback. And of course you can set your slow and fast. Go down here. You've seen me go in here. We can change what the settings are going to be, but these are more or less presets, and you can set that for whatever you're going to shoot. If you happen to shoot a lot of 4K 60 at DCI, set that up for that. Or you have 4K 24. You can move that around however you want. It's a really cool option to have that full HD 120, or you can move it over and set that to 200. Your picture mode. So you have the same as photo mode, which is quite useful, especially when you're flipping back and forth. You're doing a lot of hybrid style of shooting. You can keep that camera mode, you can keep that picture mode the same way. You have a flat function. It doesn't quite work on this H.265 mode. You'll have to go into H.264 to have that show up. Then you have OM log 400 and HLG. If you don't know what those are, these are some more advanced log color modes, which means that you can color grade this later on. And of course, if you are color grading this, it is helpful to have that corrective LUT already applied onto the screen, not on your final footage. You can set that up for view assist. So you can turn that off or on. This is going to apply a BT709 LUT onto the screen and onto the viewfinder. Your footage will still remain untouched. It's going to have that gray tone. That way you can modify that in software later. Then you have your image stabilizer. So you can turn this completely off if you want to, or you can set the image stabilizer performed by both the sensor shift and digitally. Depends on what lens you have on, that will allow you to do that. And on IS2 you have image stabilization performed by the sensor shift and not digitally. So this is performed by both sensor shift and digitally, and you have this to where you can turn the digital function of that off to where it's just the sensor shift. That sensor is moving around, compensating for that movement. And this is a cool feature. You can set this image stabilizer to be more sensitive or less sensitive depending on how you shoot. You have your sound recording settings. We'll go to HDMI output. So that way your output will be monitor. You can set it to record. For monitor, it's going to show you the information as it's going out to the HDMI. You can set it for record, so this is the video signal only to an Atomos or a Blackmagic recorder. And then we have RAW. So if your recorder has the ability to shoot RAW, like ProRes RAW, that will be an update here in the near future for this camera. You have that set up. And then of course you have a time code built in. Now down here we have our zebra patterns. So you'll find that in a lot of higher end cameras, and thankfully that's trickled down to a lot of these smaller cameras. You can set that to a level of 80%, or you can even define that for each level at 100% if you'd like. Now this is useful. Sometimes when you're recording, it's hard to see that little red dot, especially if you're really not paying attention. If you're vlogging, you're looking back, you're looking away, looking back to the camera. You may not notice if it's recording or not. You can essentially turn on a tally light for that screen if you happen to be looking into the camera and letting your talent know that they're being recorded. You can turn that red frame during recording off or on. It's a very obvious marker to see that whether or not you're recording. In here we have the card formatting settings. You can set for each card that you want to format. And you can set the card slot settings depending on what you're trying to do. We only have one card in this at the moment, but you can dedicate one card or the other for photos and videos, or photos only and then videos onto the next card. And then of course you can disable the touch screen if you don't want to worry about items being touched and turned on. You can have that disabled. And then go down to Eye Sensor Settings. You can set it to the EVF auto switch. You can have that turned off or on. Let's keep it on for now. Behavior when switched, it will maintain the screen or go to the shooting screen. It immediately prepares for shooting when you look through the EVF. When the monitor is opened, it will be either inoperative or operative. This enables the eye sensor when the monitor is flipped open, and then this disables the eye sensor when the monitor is flipped open. This is especially useful if you're using the screen when you're filming and you happen to have the camera closer to your body. Well, if you do that, that's going to create a shadow. The camera thinks that you're putting your face up to the viewfinder. Sometimes that will turn off the screen, make it a bit more challenging to shoot. So when you're holding up close like this, getting some documentary style shooting, it's not going to do that. It's going to remain on. And there you have it. There's a walkthrough of the OM-1 from OM System. Very cool camera. I hope this helped a lot of you. If you have any questions or concerns about this camera and how it can be used for your shooting situation, let us know. Visit us online at bedfords.com, visit any of our social media platforms, or visit your local Bedford location. We'd be glad to help you out. My name is Tyler with Bedford Camera and Video, and we'll see you next time.